When people think Detroit soul, they think Motown. They think Berry Gordy, Hitsville, USA, the Supremes, the Temptations. And that is completely understandable, because Motown was extraordinary. But Detroit was also full of other labels, other studios, other artists, other sounds, all of them chasing the same crown Gordy had built. And some of them won. Tonight, 12 Detroit R&B stars who built their legends outside Motown's walls, and the songs that proved Detroit's soul ran deeper than one address on West Grand Boulevard. Number 12, The Reflections, Just Like Romeo and Juliet. Before Berry Gordy bought it, there was a label called Golden World Records, owned by a Detroit businessman named Ed Wingate and his partner Joanne Bratton. And in 1964, Golden World had something Motown didn't have yet, a number 6 pop hit. It came from a white vocal group called The Reflections, a quintet from Detroit who'd been playing local clubs and talent shows since the early 1960s. Just Like Romeo and Juliet is a love song built on the most universal metaphor in the English language, delivered with a doo-wop-tinged earnestness that felt slightly nostalgic even when it was released. More like the early 1960s doo-wop sound than the sharper soul and rhythm and blues that Motown was already starting to define. And that was part of its charm. It hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1964, making it Golden World's biggest commercial achievement by a wide margin. Here is what makes the story interesting beyond the chart position. Golden World Studios were located on Davison Avenue in Detroit, close enough to Hitsville that the two labels were in genuine competition, and close enough that Berry Gordy could feel the rivalry. Gordy reportedly would drive past the Golden World building on his way to Hitsville and feel a mixture of respect and irritation at the competition operating right in his backyard. Some of the same session musicians who played on Motown records were moonlighting at Golden World on their off days, including members of the Funk Brothers, Motown's own house band. By 1966, Gordy had seen enough. He purchased Golden World outright, shut down the label, converted Golden World's recording studio into Motown's Studio B, and absorbed whatever artists and contracts he felt were worth keeping. Just Like Romeo and Juliet was the record that made Golden World's studio worth buying in the first place. The Reflections never had another top 40 hit, but they had the distinction of building the thing that Berry Gordy eventually couldn't resist adding to his empire. Number 11, Shades of Blue. Oh, How Happy. Shades of Blue, a Detroit group in the most literal sense of what that meant in 1966. An interracial vocal group, 2 white and 2 black members, performing together on stage at a time when that combination was still genuinely unusual in American pop music. The kind of thing that could get a show canceled in certain markets. Their sound was pure Detroit pop soul, polished harmonies, a bright rhythm section, and lyrics built for the radio. The song was written partly by Edwin Starr, who at the time was working his way toward his own solo success on the Ric-Tic label across town. Starr co-wrote Oh How Happy and handed it to the group, whose label, Impact Records, released it in 1966. It hit number 12 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent 15 weeks on the chart, a genuine, mainstream crossover hit by a Detroit act operating completely outside of Motown's infrastructure. The story of Shades of Blue is relatively brief in terms of commercial success. Oh How Happy was their biggest hit, and the follow-ups never reached the same heights. But the record itself is a snapshot of something real and important about Detroit's music scene in the mid-1960s.
that somehow we carried on.
The city was producing hits on multiple labels simultaneously, with overlapping rosters of musicians and songwriters moving between projects, building a sound that was recognizably Detroit even when it came from outside Hitsville's walls. The interracial angle of the group is not a footnote, it's a defining characteristic. In a year when American cities were still processing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, a Detroit pop group with black and white members sitting comfortably on the same record label was itself a statement about what Detroit's music community believed was possible. Edwin Starr's songwriting credit on the track ties it directly into the broader non-Motown Detroit soul ecosystem that the entire city was building around Gordy's operation. Number 10. Darrell Banks, Open the Door to Your Heart. Darrell Banks, born Darrell Eubanks in Mansfield, Ohio in 1937, raised by grandparents, moved to Buffalo as a young man, learned to sing in church, started performing in local clubs where he developed a voice that people who heard it described as one of the finest in soul music, a raw, gospel-drenched instrument that didn't need production tricks or string arrangements to stop a room. He wound up in Detroit through a club owner named Doc Murphy, who introduced him to producer LeBaron Taylor, and in the summer of 1966, Darrell Banks walked into Golden World Studios, the same studio Berry Gordy was about to buy from Ed Wingate, and recorded a track called Open the Door to Your Heart. The studio musicians playing behind him were, in large part, the Funk Brothers, Motown's own session band, moonlighting across town on a record that would compete directly with Hitsville's output on the radio. The song's authorship became a legal battleground almost immediately. Banks' friend, songwriter Donnie Elbert, had written the melody and brought it to the session, but when the record came out, only Banks's name appeared in the writing credits. Elbert sued. The courts eventually ruled in his favor, though by the time the case was settled, the record had already done its work. Darling, you've been so... Open the Door to Your Heart peaked at number 2 on the R&B chart and number 27 pop in 1966. Critics called it one of the finest non-Motown records ever to come out of Detroit. Darrell Banks never had another hit of that magnitude. He moved between labels, Atco, Cotillion, Stax's Volt imprint, and never fully broke through a second time. And then on February 24, 1970, at 32 years old, he was shot and killed in Detroit. An off-duty police officer had been secretly seeing Banks's girlfriend. Banks confronted him. He pulled a gun. The officer fired. Darrell Banks died in the hospital. The voice that had come within one chart position of matching the Temptations in 1966 was gone at 32, with most of what it could have done still inside it. That's what keeps my love so... Number 9. J.J. Barnes, Baby Please Come Back Home. James J. Barnes, born in Detroit in 1943, started recording at 17 years old, bouncing between small local labels, Mickey, Scepter, Ring, Ric-Tic, releasing soul singles that barely charted in America, but built him a devoted underground following in Britain, where the northern soul scene was discovering American soul 45s that had been largely ignored on their home soil. His Ric-Tic recordings especially, tracks like Please Let Me In and Real Humdinger, backed by the same moonlighting Funk Brothers who played on the Darrell Banks session, became cornerstone records of the northern soul scene, the kind of rare soul 45s that DJs at all-night venues like Manchester's Twisted Wheel would play to packed dance floors of dedicated dancers who knew every note. Barnes briefly passed through Motown as a songwriter, co-writing Show Me the Way for Martha and the Vandellas and material for the Marvelettes. but he never had an official Motown release as a vocalist. His biggest American hit came in 1967 on the Groovesville label with Baby Please Come Back Home, which hit number 9 on the R&B chart. A beautiful, pleading ballad with Barnes's voice front and center, and one of the most emotionally direct vocal performances on the Detroit soul underground circuit. His story after that is, in many ways, a transatlantic one. His friend Edwin Starr encouraged him to come to England in the 1970s, where he became genuinely popular performing for Northern Soul audiences who treated him like royalty. He made records for Contempo Records, toured the UK circuit for decades, and built a career sustained almost entirely by British fans who had discovered his music on obscure American labels that most people in the United States had never heard of. James J. Barnes died in December 2022, at 79 years old, beloved in England, in a way he never quite achieved in the city that made him.
Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload.
Number 8. Edwin Starr, Agent 00 Soul. Here is the artist Berry Gordy wanted so badly that he bought an entire record label to get him. Edwin Starr, born Charles Edwin Hatcher in Nashville, raised in Cleveland, moved to Detroit, made his first recordings in 1965 for Ric-Tic Records, the Detroit label owned by Ed Wingate, the same man who ran Golden World. Starr had been performing with Bill Doggett's band when he was spotted at the legendary 20 Grand Club in Detroit by a local DJ and impresario named LeBaron Taylor, who arranged a recording session at Golden World Studios. The song Starr brought to the session was built around the James Bond film craze that was sweeping American pop culture at the time. He'd been developing the idea while still touring with Doggett's band. Agent 00 Soul launched his career, backed by the Funk Brothers in yet another of their covert off-hours sessions at a rival studio, and it became a massive hit on the British Northern Soul scene, one of the records historians now say helped start the entire movement. Starr kept releasing hits on Ric-Tic, Headline News, Stop Her on Sight, Backstreet, and Berry Gordy kept watching. The success of Edwin Starr and the other Ric-Tic artists was making Motown look over its shoulder at its own backyard, and Gordy finally decided to stop competing and simply purchase the competition. In 1968, Motown bought Ric-Tic outright. Edwin Starr was now a Motown artist. At Motown, he would go on to record War in 1970, which hit #1 pop and became one of the greatest protest records in American history. His Ric-Tic gravestone at his burial in Nottingham, England, where he died in 2003, reads, Our Agent 00 Soul. The man Motown bought an entire label to acquire, spent his career proving the purchase was worth every dollar. Number 7. The Fantastic Four. The Whole World is a Stage. The Fantastic Four are the act that Ric-Tic's owner, Ed Wingate, reportedly favored over Edwin Starr in terms of commercial potential on the American market. Starr was big on the Northern Soul underground in Britain. The Fantastic Four were bigger in the United States, Ric-Tic's best-selling domestic act, with a run of Detroit soul singles that built a genuine mainstream following throughout 1966 and 1967. The group, Joseph Sweet Williams, Wallace Childs, Cleveland Horn, and Ernest Newsom formed in Detroit in the mid-1960s and signed to Ric-Tic, where they recorded a series of polished soul records with a vocal group sound that sat comfortably between the Temptations' harmonic sophistication and a rawer, more stripped-down Detroit funk. The Whole World is a Stage, released in 1967, reached number 6 on the R&B chart and became their signature record, a theatrical, gospel-inflected soul workout with a vocal arrangement that showcased the group's full range. When Motown bought Ric-Tic in 1968, the Fantastic Four came with the deal, signing to Motown's soul subsidiary. Their career at Motown never reached the same heights as their Ric-Tic run, in part because the label had so many competing priorities within its own roster. But their Ric-Tic catalog has maintained a devoted following in northern soul circles in the UK, where their records from the mid-1960s are considered essential documents of the Detroit soul scene that was building right outside Motown's walls. Their story is a reminder that Berry Gordy didn't just buy Ric-Tic to get Edwin Starr. The Fantastic Four were the label's commercial backbone in the American market, and they were good enough that Gordy felt he needed to own them rather than compete with them. Number 6, The Dramatics. What you see is what you get. The Dramatics. Detroit-born and Detroit-bred, formed in 1962 when they were teenagers calling themselves the Sensations. They spent nearly a decade bouncing between small Detroit labels, Wingate, Sport, Groovesville, before making their first recordings for Volt Records, Stax's soul subsidiary, in 1969. That first attempt went nowhere. Volt let them go. And then everything changed. In 1971, a Detroit songwriter and producer named Tony Hester spotted them at a club and offered them a song he'd written called What You See Is What You Get. The title phrase was borrowed from comedian Flip Wilson's character Geraldine Jones on The Flip Wilson Show, which was one of the most watched programs on American television at the time. Hester built the song around the group's rare asset, 5 genuinely different lead vocalists, each with his own character and tone, who could trade lines and verses in a way that sounded effortless. Volt re-signed the Dramatics immediately. What You See Is What You Get hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on the R&B chart in 1971, launching a run of hits that included the iconic In the Rain, a slow, building ballad with thunder and rain sounds embedded in the recording, and turning the Dramatics into one of the most respected vocal groups in 1970s soul. James Brown, who took the group on an 8-month cross-country tour after their breakthrough, reportedly told them during that tour, "I love you guys 'cause you sweat a lot." In James Brown's vocabulary, that is the highest possible compliment. A Detroit vocal group, passed over for almost a decade, had finally found their moment, and when they did, James Brown himself put his stamp of approval on them. Number 5, Chairman of the Board. Give Me Just a Little More Time. The Chairmen of the Board. Not a Detroit-born group in the strictest sense. Lead singer General Johnson was from Virginia, and the group came together through various East Coast connections. But they are absolutely a product of the post-Motown Detroit music infrastructure that Holland-Dozier-Holland built with their Invictus and Hot Wax labels right there in the city. When HDH launched Invictus Records in 1969 after their bitter departure from Motown, they needed a flagship male vocal act to anchor the new label. General Johnson's voice, a warm, expressive tenor with genuine emotional range, was exactly what they were looking for. Brian Holland and Lamont Dozier began writing specifically for Johnson's strengths, just as they had done for Levi Stubbs at the Four Tops years earlier. The result was Give Me Just a Little More Time, released in February 1970. It hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 2 on the R&B chart, selling over 1 million copies and becoming one of the first major chart successes for the HDH rival label operation.
We must climb, let's climb it together.
The song's production is unmistakably in the tradition of their Motown work. Lush strings, a driving rhythm section, a vocal hook that lodges itself in the listener's brain immediately, but with a slightly looser, funkier feel that reflected the changing sonic landscape of early 1970s soul. For Holland-Dozier-Holland, Give Me Just a Little More Time was the proof of concept. They had left Motown, they had survived 2 years of Gordy's legal injunction, they had set up shop in the same city with their own label, and within months of their first releases, they had a top 3 pop hit, right in Motown's backyard, using the same musical language, with an artist Gordy's label didn't have. Number 4. Laura Lee, Women's Love Rights.
I'm starting a new movement today for women's love rights.
Laura Lee, born Laura Lee Newton in Chicago in 1945, raised in Detroit, trained as a gospel singer from childhood, and by the time she came to the attention of the music industry in the mid-1960s, she had a voice with the full weight of that gospel upbringing behind every note. She had a brief early run at Chess Records before signing with Holland-Dozier-Holland's Hot Wax label in the early 1970s, where she became one of the label's most important acts. And in 1971 she recorded Women's Love Rights, a song she wrote herself, one of the first explicitly feminist soul anthems on the radio, a direct, unflinching statement about a woman's right to give and receive love on her own terms, in a year when such a statement in a soul record was still genuinely provocative. The song hit number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on the R&B chart, making it one of Laura Lee's biggest commercial successes and one of the strongest entries in the Hot Wax catalog. And it came from a place of genuine conviction. Lee later said in interviews that she wrote from her own experience, that the songs that came from the deepest personal truth were always the ones that connected most directly with listeners. The feminist angle of women's love rights places it in the same conversation as Aretha Franklin's Respect, Jean Knight's Mr. Big Stuff, and Betty Wright's Clean Up Woman, all roughly contemporaneous records by black women asserting direct, unambiguous agency in the language of soul music. Lee's version came from Detroit, from HDH's rival label, and it did it as convincingly as anything Motown was producing at the same time. Number 3. The Detroit Emeralds, Baby Let Me Take You, In My Arms.
Let me take you.
The Detroit Emeralds, a vocal group from Little Rock, Arkansas, who relocated to Detroit in the late 1960s and took the city's name as their own, a deliberate statement that they were planting their flag in the Detroit soul tradition. They signed to Ric-Tic briefly in 1968 and had their first R&B chart appearance with Showtime, and then moved to Westbound Records, a Detroit-based independent founded by Armin Baladian in 1968 that would go on to release records by Funkadelic, Ohio Players, and the Detroit Emeralds throughout the early 1970s. Their producer and chief songwriter was Abram Tillman, a member of the group who also handled arrangements. And Tillman had a specific, almost cinematic approach to soul production. Lush strings, careful harmonic layering, a silky smooth vocal blend that could pivot from warmth to yearning on a dime. The Emeralds had been touring in Memphis when they recorded a set of demos at Willie Mitchell's High Recording Studios, the same studio that produced Al Green's entire run of hits. They took the basic tracks back to Detroit and added horns, strings, and vocal overdubs. The result was their breakthrough album, You Want It, You Got It, and its commercial peak was Baby Let Me Take You, In My Arms, which hit number 4 on the R&B chart and number 24 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972. The sound is unmistakably in conversation, with everything being made in Detroit's soul tradition, but it came from an independent label, a self-produced songwriter, and a group that had borrowed the city's name and then made music worthy of it. Abram Tillman wrote every one of their hits. When the group dissolved amid management disputes in 1974, that particular engine stopped, but Baby Let Me Take You still sounds as good as anything in the Detroit soul canon. Number 2. Dennis Coffey, Scorpio. Dennis Coffey had already played on more hit records than most people will ever hear before he ever released one under his own name. Born in Detroit in 1940, Coffey was a session guitarist who became one of the most sought-after players in the city during the 1960s, appearing on sessions at Motown and at competing labels simultaneously, because his wah-wah guitar sound and his ability to lock into a groove and make it undeniable were simply too useful to leave idle. His electric sitar can be heard on Freda Payne's Band of Gold, Holland-Dozier-Holland's rival label hit, because he was on the same session circuit that everybody in Detroit's soul world moved through regardless of which label's name was on the door. In 1971, the Funk Brothers, Motown's house band, with whom Coffey had played countless sessions, were becoming increasingly restless under Motown's declining creative environment and the label's impending move to Los Angeles. Some of them appeared on Coffey's own debut album for Sussex Records, Evolution, and the lead single from that album, Scorpio, was a 7-minute funk instrumental built entirely around Coffey's wah-wah guitar in a slow, insistent groove that sounded like it was stalking something across a darkened room. Scorpio was edited to a single edit and released in late 1971. It hit number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, becoming one of the few instrumental hits of the era, and it went to number 1 on the R&B chart. It was one of the earliest widely successful uses of the wah-wah pedal as a lead instrument in funk and soul music, and its influence on subsequent funk production is significant. It's been sampled repeatedly over the decades by hip-hop producers who recognized the groove's inherent power. The man who had played on everyone else's sessions for a decade had finally made the one that everyone would talk about. The Funk Brothers helped him do it. Number 1. Freda Payne, Band of Gold. Freda Payne, born in Detroit in 1942. She had been performing since childhood, trained as a classical pianist, spent years working on the supper club circuit and cutting records that showed enormous promise, but never broke through. She passed through MGM Records, ABC Paramount, and Impulse, records without a hit of real commercial substance. Talented, professional, experienced, and frustratingly undiscovered. When Holland-Dozier-Holland launched Invictus Records in 1969, after leaving Motown, they were looking for the kind of singer who could carry the emotional weight of the music they wanted to make. They were not yet cleared to use their own names as producers and songwriters on Invictus releases. Gordy's lawyers had them operating under the pseudonym Edith Wayne while the legal dust settled, so the records had to speak for themselves without the HDH brand. They needed voices that would make listeners forget to wonder who produced it. Freda Payne was initially resistant to the song they brought her, Band of Gold, a song about a marriage that was never consummated, a bride alone in a hotel room on her wedding night, asking where the warm caress of yesterday had gone. Felt too young for her, she said. She was nearly 30. Producer Ron Dunbar reportedly told her, "You don't have to like it, just sing it." He recorded her in fragments, dubbing the track 25 or 30 times to get enough usable material to edit together. The result was one of the most emotionally devastating recordings to come out of Detroit's entire soul era. Band of Gold hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1970, and number 1 in the United Kingdom, launching Freda Payne into a level of mainstream recognition she had spent over a decade pursuing. The Funk Brothers played on it. The background vocalists included Joyce Vincent Wilson and Thelma Hopkins, who would later form Tony Orlando and Dawn. The lead guitar was played by a young Ray Parker Jr. on one of his earliest major sessions. It was a record made by Detroit people, for a Detroit label, in a Detroit studio, with Detroit musicians, none of them operating inside Motown's building on West Grand Boulevard. The crown that had Gordy's name on it had been pulled off its pedestal, for at least one glorious record, by the people who had helped build the pedestal in the first place. 12 artists, 12 labels, 12 sounds that came out of the same city that gave the world Motown and proved, record by record, that Detroit's genius was never contained by one label's walls. Berry Gordy built something extraordinary, but the city he built it in was full of extraordinary people who had their own records to make, their own sounds to find, their own crowns to chase. Some of them are household names. Some of them are Northern Soul legends more famous in England than in the city that made them. And all of them are Detroit. Subscribe if you want more of the real story behind the music.